We've been talking about the history of American Christianity, in particular ways that it has influenced government and politics and law, and ways that it has been influenced by the American system of government and politics and law. And I just had some more thoughts this morning when I was kind of putting some last minute touches on this, and I thought of some of the things we're going to say this morning are glorious manifestations of the Holy Spirit at work in the church. And then some of the things we're going to look at are more kind of cringeworthy. You'd like to look away. And it makes me think, when I think about the church sometimes, I like the analogy of Noah's Ark, where God, the people in Noah's Ark were not there because they were perfect. They certainly weren't a perfect group of people, and sometimes the smells probably were not great inside the ark, and sometimes they'd probably look in the corners and see piles of things that needed some attention. But it was better than being on the outside of the ark, right? And that's sort of life in the church. The church has never been perfect. It never will be perfect because it's made of lots of imperfect human beings like us. And yet, God has promised that He would build His church and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And that is a promise He will keep. It's not a promise that every single individual church and every individual location won't go off and crash in the ditch. But He has promised that His universal worldwide church, of which we are a part, that He will cause His church to survive and prevail. And so I think that's a great reminder as we look this morning at the history of the American church and some of the ways that it bounces off this guardrail and then bounces off that guardrail, that ultimately it's the faithfulness of God that keeps us from completely going off into one ditch or another. Which is not to say that the ark didn't need from time to time some repairs to the roof, or some pumping water out of the bilge, or some shoveling of things, shoveling manure overboard. The church it's an institution made of imperfect human beings, but headed up by Jesus Christ. So, all right. So with that said, we looked at the last few weeks. We looked at the fact from the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower in 1620, and for the 1600s, the church in America had a very strong Puritan flavor. In fact, it permeated all through American society, and including American law and government and politics. And then we looked at the fact that as the turn of the century into about 1700, there started to be already declines in the vitality of the church. We talked about the First Great Awakening, which took place in the 1730s and 1740s. So this is still a generation or two before the American Revolution. And then we looked at the events of the American Revolution. We saw that there were pretty steep declines in religious participation throughout the 1700s. And in fact, probably the low tide of participation in church life was in the 1770s and 1780s. We looked last week at some of the reasons for that. You had state-established, state-funded churches, and that often in those state-established churches, the clergy, the pastors, sometimes just mailed it in. Sometimes they got lazy because they were at a salary either way, regardless of what happened. We talked about the frontier factor, how there was, I think I read this week that in the year 1850, there were 92,000 people lived in California. 85,000 of them were men. So that, and most of them were young men, transient, that not a very churchy group, right? So you have the frontier factor. And then we talked about the fact that there was already liberal theology creeping into especially the Ivy League seminaries. And then this really dramatic thing happened. You had the American Revolution in 1776 and the 1780s to sort that out. And the real jolt to the American church of disestablishment. So there was no longer going to be an established church of America, not even of the colonies. And so that disestablishment, that deformalizing, that decoupling of church and state, which happened in the American Revolution. So the Revolution, 1770s and 1780s, and then this is more what we're going to spend our time on this morning. The Second Great Awakening, as it's known, which really was a series of spiritual awakenings that began in the 1790s and were really kind of grew like wildfire through the 1830s. And we're going to look at ways in which the Second Great Awakening was shaped by its engagement with the new American Republic, and ways that the new American Republic was shaped by the Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening was another wave of religious revival, specifically Christian revivalism. And this time it led to really dramatic growth in the overall participation of people in the American church. During this period of 1790 to 1830, church membership and participation grew at 3 times the rate of the population growth. So if the population grew by 100%, then the church participation grew by 300%, right? The really interesting thing that happens, and maybe this isn't something that would have been predicted, but the fact that the church was disestablished, right? There was no longer a formal state church. That seemed to have been a real stimulus for explosive church growth in the next couple of generations after the American Revolution. And we're going to look at that. So what's been described as a monopoly of state-established churches. For example, in New England, the Puritans kind of had a monopoly on church life. That they didn't want other denominations starting up churches. They were very influential in government. They started the public schools and ran the public schools. With that sort of monopoly broken, you had this sudden surge, this sudden rocketing upward of new denominations, new churches springing up in this sort of free market, unregulated environment of American Christianity. Does that make sense? So we'll look at some examples of that. But much of the growth in church life and church participation was spurred by traveling, itinerant, horseback pastors and evangelists. And these were, by and large, men who worked for very little pay under really difficult frontier conditions. The kind of the stereotype is the itinerant circuit riding preacher, but this really was what it was like. There were lots and lots of these guys who were traveling throughout from town to town and outpost to outpost through the American frontier, and planting churches, preaching in front of groups of people who would come together. And these men were largely from the Methodist denomination and the Baptist denominations, and they were cut from the same cloth, you could say, as their flock. In other words, most of them had very little formal theological training. Most of them were from the working classes, from the farming classes. In 1844, the Methodist General Conference reported they had 4,282 traveling preachers. Fewer than 50 of them had more than an elementary school, grade school education. Some of them didn't even have that. It's pretty common if you're on the frontier. There weren't schools. My great-grandmother from Chester only could go to school through the 8th grade because that was you had to board in town 15 miles away, and you had to rent it was really difficult to go to school often beyond your local district school. Ken and Greta, it's probably still that way when you were growing up. It was a long way to the nearest public high school when you lived in a ranch, right? So these circuit riding preachers looked very much like the people that they were ministering to. By contrast of the Puritan churches, we use these words interchangeably, Puritan and Congregationalist. 95% of the Puritan pastors were college graduates. They were the exception because very few people went to college in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So it was the Puritan pastors who were definitely the exception. The rule was more these traveling Methodist and Baptist pastors who were not educated. Many of them taught themselves to read. And so the established church pastors, the Puritans and Anglicans, they were usually well paid. They usually stayed in one post for a lifetime, usually more of an urban type of ministry, whereas the itinerant circuit riding pastors were often paid and nothing more than people feeding them when they showed up to preach, right, and sending them with a side of salt pork and beans or something, right, as they traveled around from town to town. And you can imagine if you're living in the wilderness trying to carve out, you're really happy to see somebody, anybody, right? And as a result, these Baptist and Methodist churches were usually the vast majority of the new churches being birthed on the American frontier were Methodist and Baptist churches. The most famous Methodist circuit riding preacher was a man named Francis Asbury, early 1800s. He logged 300,000 miles in his lifetime on horseback. That is crazy to think of. This is obviously no cars. This is all on horseback and on foot. 300,000 miles in a lifetime. Much of that was across untamed wilderness. I don't know how many times he must have nearly gotten eaten by a mountain lion or nearly, he would have, his life would be quite an adventure story. These traveling circuit riding preachers did not have a complicated message. There wasn't lots of deep theological exposition. They mainly stressed human sinfulness, the need for salvation, judgment, personal conversion, and holy living. It was a pretty simple gospel message that they preached. Their sermons were largely, they would have them memorized. They'd have 5 or 6 sermons that they had memorized and polished up really well, and they would do the same sermon from place to place. Whereas if you're a Puritan, theologically trained, Harvard-trained pastor in Boston, their sermons were often 2 hours long every week to the same group of people in the same pew. So a very different style of preaching and doing church together. Thoughts or questions on this?
Francis Asbury must be very glad that he's dead.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure he had some. He probably was bow-legged. If you do 300,000 miles on horseback.
That's not why I'm saying he's glad he's dead. He's glad he's dead because of where the Methodist Church has gone.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, I missed it the first time.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the Methodist Church had fantastic roots. Really gospel-centered roots. You had the Wesleys and wonderful gospel roots. They were the missionaries that that preached the gospel on the American frontier. So, another really famous aspect of the Second Great Awakening was what was called camp meetings. And these were often week-long, sometimes 2-week-long gatherings attended by entire families who would travel long distances to get there. Much singing, really obviously social, sometimes the only times people would see each other. A real outpouring of emotion, often an eruption of what we would think of as charismatic type gifts, speaking in tongues, just lots of tears and emotions and singing and real outpouring of religious emotion. Often a really festive holiday atmosphere, people experiencing great loneliness and isolation of pioneer life. So these were much looked forward to camp meetings. The most famous of the camp meetings was one in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in the year 1801. There were 10,000 people who attended this camp meeting over the course of a week. The largest town in Kentucky at the time had 2,000 people. So this is people coming from all over the place, from significant distances on foot or on horseback. One person who was there described it as sinners falling, shrieks and cries for mercy, which reminded one of Judgment Day. Not surprisingly, camp meeting revivalism drew a lot of criticism from the older Puritan and Anglican denominations who just didn't like this style of doing church. In fact, so the most meteoric growth in churches in the American colonies, it took place in the South, which had previously been not very churched at all, and it took place on the western frontier. Along the eastern seaboard, especially New England, it was already very churched, right? So a lot of this explosive growth happened in the South and the West. And again, we talked about the frontier factor, how much of the West was a lot of young men seeking fortunes and not a lot of families. So as these areas became more established and more stable and more women and families and schools, that's where a lot of these churches were getting planted, is in the West. Again, the two denominations which saw the most explosive group were the Baptists, and far and away the biggest was the Methodists. And the reason the word Methodist wasn't, they just thought of themselves as Anglicans, but they were, sometimes groups are given a nickname which they didn't choose for themselves, and it's sometimes meant to be an insult, but it ends up sticking. And the term Methodist came because they had methods for planting churches and circuit riding preachers and methods for discipling people, and they really had their system down, and it was really effective. But they also just were willing to endure a lot of hardship at very low pay. So they were really famous for their circuit riding preachers and evangelists. Again, this new style of church life came at the expense of Puritan Congregationalist churches and Anglican Episcopal churches. In many places in New England on the eastern seaboard, the Puritan churches actually passed local laws, passed ordinances trying to prohibit these traveling preachers from coming to their towns or speaking in their towns, which is why they often happened out in fields and in forests, is because they weren't given access to pulpits. And this is a formal statement issued by the president and the entire faculty of Harvard, which was a Puritan seminary, a statement entitled "A Testimony Against the Reverend Mr. George Whitefield and His Conduct." They didn't like this style of circuit riding, preaching, and camp meetings, and the emotional style of religion, and they actively tried to suppress it. Of course, their efforts dramatically failed. But they were often the ones who people were leaving the Puritan congregations and shifting over to these Methodist and Baptist congregations. This is a interesting graph. So I don't know if you can see this well or not. The top is the Congregationalists or Puritans. In 1776, Puritans made up 20% of American Christians. In 1850, they were shrunk down to 4% of American Christians. The opposite end of the spectrum, you had Methodists were 2.5% in 1776, and in 1850 they were 34% of American church attenders. So you had this dramatic shift. And again, the ones who really, the Episcopalians, they were the Anglicans, the Church of England. You could imagine how they would take a big hit when America just fought a war with England. They were the Church of England. So it's not surprising that they took a big hit, but it was more surprising the rapid collapse of the Puritan/Congregationalist churches. Again, you see the Baptist went from 16% to 20%, but the really dramatic growth was the Methodists. This is the light colored bar is 1776. The dark colored bar is 1850. Thoughts on this or?
It's interesting that the Episcopalians really lost, but then the Catholics.
Most of the Catholic growth was actually new immigration from Europe, but people who were Catholic in Europe. And then there was large amounts of Southern European and Eastern European Catholics. So a lot of that growth was immigration growth. Yeah. Although I learned this, that a lot of the Catholic organizations in the 1800s adopted some of the camp style, traveling pastor style. They adopted some of the same methods that the Protestants were using, which doesn't really fit what you think of as the traditional Catholic model. But they saw what was working on the frontier, and they tried to use some of the same methods. So again, the greatest winner, if you can use that word, by far was the Methodists. In 1776, the colonies had 65 Methodist churches. By 1850, they had 13,302 Methodist churches. And
They're back down. Now they're headed.
Yeah, it's headed in the
headed back
other
down to
direction.
65.
Right. Second to the Methodists in growth were the Baptists. The greatest losers, if you can use that word, were the Puritans/Congregationalists and the Anglicans/Episcopalians. I don't know if the Anglican Church was the Church of England. When it came to America and the war happened, they couldn't call it the Church of England anymore. So they changed the name to Episcopalian. But it's the same, it was the same church, right? So also in this period, you have the explosion of some really weird, unorthodox, cultish, fringe sects like the Mormons, and you had Seventh-day Adventists, Millerites, Campbellites, Shakers. Many of these groups had really bizarre practices. So the Shakers forbid sexual actions of any kind, even in marriage. Whereas the Mormons, they said, well, we'll take your women. And so the Shakers didn't grow very well because they didn't ever have babies, or they weren't supposed to have babies. And the Mormons were having lots of babies. So you have all kinds of really crazy things proliferating in this sort of free market of religion. Many of these groups were utopian in nature. They were commune-based in nature. They had weird approaches to sexuality, really unorthodox theology that was significant departure from traditional Christianity. But again, these groups which would not have probably been able to take root in Europe, where you had established churches who sort of had an embargo on anything else, you didn't see this kind of cult growth in Europe. America was like a petri dish for this kind of stuff because of this just sort of free-for-all of religion. Thoughts on this? Yeah, Buck.
I can't help but wonder, if we're going through this, what effect, like the Puritans at that time in the 1700s, did they make theology more of an intellectual pursuit like the Methodists have today, instead of a practical pursuit?
Yeah.
Is that why I don't know if it's just loosely correlated, or if that factor is somehow poisonous to the church.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a great question. And I don't know if I can answer all these things definitively. But it's interesting to think when the Puritans came over, they were the religious minority, right? They were the ones fleeing religious persecution. They were pretty democratic. That's why they called themselves Congregationalists, because they were pretty, much more than the Anglican Church, which they were fleeing. They were sort of the grassroots, ground up religious minorities. But they, over time, become the establishment, and as they become the establishment, they seem to lose their religious vitality. Make of that what you will. I don't think you asked about they're theologically much better educated. Does that contribute to their decline in vitality? I would like to think that studying
Strictly an intellectual pursuit, like you get a degree in
Right.
theology, and that seems to be what installs you as a leader of the church.
Right.
The fact that you have the degree,
Right.
not the fact that you're pursuing.
Does your study of theology just become academic rather than, and do you lose sight of the heart of the gospel? That clearly happened.
Kind of what
Does-
you preach about this morning too, like, because it was talking to the.
Right, the Pharisees,
They're the ones
they
that
knew
were
the Bible,
educated,
yeah, they were,
the ones that were choosing not to do it.
right, that's right. Yeah, Heather said that the Pharisees were the most theologically educated people of their day, but it doesn't insulate you from losing track of the actual gospel, right? It's not to say, I don't ever want to say that theological study is bad. I think it's good, but it also seems to come with some inherent dangers of just turning it into an academic study rather than an actual life, right? So I just give you some examples, and this was one of the most famous itinerant preachers of the day. His name, I don't think this was a mother's birth certificate name, but Crazy Lorenzo Dow is how he was known. He had long hair, he had raggedy clothes, sort of a self-styled John the Baptist of the American frontier. Spoke at 500 to 800 meetings per year. That's crazy. In 1805, 1 year alone, he traveled 10,000 miles on horseback or on foot from New England all the way to Alabama. He was also, interestingly enough, an outspoken supporter of Jeffersonian, the Democratic Party of Jefferson and the common man. So you start to see some alignment between sort of the grassroots camp-style revivalist type of religion and the Jeffersonian democracy versus the more established Puritan and a sort of a different way of approaching politics as well. Far and away, the most famous figure in the Second Great Awakening was a man named Charles Finney. He was from Western New York. Several historians have said they believe he's among the 4 or 5 most influential Americans, not just religious people, but anybody in the century. Like, he was better known than presidents, they said. Just really, really influential. As a young man, he was training to be a lawyer. He had a dramatic conversion experience. He left the law and took up a career as a traveling preacher, though he had never had any formal theological training. His sermons placed a really heavy emphasis on free will, as opposed to the Puritan doctrine of election and predestination and sort of these Calvinistic doctrines. He placed a strong emphasis on the individual's choice to follow God, to follow Christ, and change your life. He had a pretty, I would say, sort of unorthodox doctrine that sinners are capable on their own of seeing the light and choosing the good. He really disliked the Puritan doctrine of total depravity. But a very effective preacher and evangelist, known for his unorthodox, innovative methods of preaching and holding these camp meetings. Much more prominent role for women in his meetings. He would frequently call out people by name who he thought were in need of repentance and conversion, including local pastors from other churches. Always extemporaneous style, a really charismatic style of preaching. He was also an outspoken abolitionist. He frequently condemned slavery from the pulpit. He refused to allow slave owners to participate in communion. That was a pretty radical stance at the time. As this is still 50 years before the 50 years before the Civil War. Finney, after he had been ministering for a number of years, he wrote a handbook on conducting revival services. It was titled Lectures on Revivals of Religion, and this is a direct quote. He wrote that revivals aren't miraculous, that they simply result from the application of a correct set of techniques. Here's his direct quote. He says, "A revival isn't a miracle or above the powers of nature. There is nothing in religion beyond the ordinary powers of nature. It consists entirely in right exercise of the powers of nature." Newton's laws of physics were really still, the Enlightenment ideas were still really powerful. He said it is just that and nothing else. When mankind becomes religious, they are not enabled to put forth exertions which they were unable before to put forth. They only exert powers which they had before in a different way and use them for the glory of God. You can see some of the Enlightenment thinking that's sort of trickled down into his theology a little bit, I think. Again, this was a sharp contrast with Jonathan Edwards' kind of towering Calvinist theology, which placed a really heavy emphasis on God's sovereignty and God's initiative and kind of human inability to even want God or even want to draw near to God. So this is another quote from Finney, who said, "The established churches," that would be the Puritans and the Anglicans, they're lording it over you. He told his audience that many of these churches were led by unconverted ministers, which may have been true in places, but other times it probably wasn't true. As one might imagine, he was deeply resented by many of the ministers in these older established churches, especially the Puritans. And here's another chart that gives. So this is, I don't know if you can see this, 1776, which we said was kind of the low tide. You had a lot of religious involvement. It kind of sunk to a low tide. This is a lot of this information, again, as I mentioned last week, comes from kind of the two books that are kind of the Bibles on American early Christian history and church growth. 17% of people attending churches in 1776 or claiming adherence, membership to a church. And then that jumped by the start of the Civil War to 37%, took a dip during the Civil War as there was just so much displacement and destruction in the country, and then began to rise sharply after the Civil War again, and probably peaked around the 70s or 80s, actually, in terms of people not necessarily going to church, but at least claiming church membership or claiming affiliation to some church body. So maybe before we go on, thoughts or comments or questions or... This is a class on theology of government and politics. So one of the things I want to ask is, how did the American Revolution affect Christianity? How did Christianity affect the American Revolution? Because there was influence clearly in both directions. There was, I think it's pretty clear, especially when you compare it to Europe, that American Christianity had sort of a grassroots, kind of bottom-up, kind of democratic nature to the way American churches were started and the way they grew, especially in the Second Great Awakening, which in some ways paralleled this new style of government in American democracy, American Democratic Republic. I think there are pros and cons. We can look at strengths and weaknesses to both types of doing church. We mentioned this a little bit ago, but Puritanism had also started out as kind of a democratic, bottom-up, grassroots expression of Christianity, but it had, over 100 years, become the establishment. And then I think you see some similarities. There was something in the air between the bottom-up revivalist style religion and the American revolutionary spirit. I'm making that case. You can feel free to push back. This isn't something that's written in our Bible. So, but this newer post-revolutionary style of church was sort of anti-hierarchical. Your European churches were very hierarchical. You had a bishop and you had these hierarchies, and they were very top-down. In the New American style, it was very populist and sort of bottom-up. Changing from church hierarchy to more congregational rule. We could talk about the founding of the Evangelical Free Church of America. We're much more, the EFCA is a congregational style government. It was in reaction to the state church of Scandinavia, which is why we call ourselves the Free Church, to distinguish ourselves from a state church. So the Free Church was very much in this type of, in this spirit, right? A general sense in the culture that just as older hierarchical forms of government with a king, right, are being torn down and replaced by revolutionary populist uprisings, that something similar should happen in the church. It should be less top down and more bottom up. Again, church governance had been quite hierarchical. The new religious denominations became highly democratic or congregational in their governance style. Traveling preachers like Charles Finney, who was a self-made evangelist, they were not under the authority of any denominational body, hadn't been to a seminary, so he was sort of, in some ways, self-taught and sort of had a self-formulated theology. It was Christian, but it didn't come from a particular theological system like Calvinism or something like that. There was definitely a less of an emphasis on church authority and more emphasis on the authority of the Holy Spirit discerned by the individual believer. You could definitely see this difference between the established Puritan churches versus these new denominations. Thoughts about this? This is a lot, I realize, but there was the spirit of revolution was sort of in the air in this new country that's a new thing on planet Earth. Sort of a celebration of new things over old things, more of a suspicion of received tradition, and you can see that in worship styles. There was more of a rejection of liturgical styles of worship and a rise of more spontaneous and emotional forms of worship. It seems to be, Finney sort of embodies this more than anybody, but a greater emphasis on human ability. Finney sort of departed from the Calvinistic doctrine that makes God the very clear subject and man as the object, to, I would argue, more of a man-centered approach that emphasizes a human being's ability to sort of will himself toward God. The Puritans didn't like his doctrine very much either. So, and I think I would argue that some of this is Enlightenment thinking still in the air. This view of man's rational capacity to problem solve. You could see this in his pamphlet on how to have a successful camp meeting, or how to have there's laws to the universe which we can figure out, and we just need to apply those laws, and they apply to religious things as well as physics, right? So a huge emphasis on the common sense of the common man, in opposition to sometimes an educated elite who seemed out of touch with the common people. In Europe, religion was still very much associated with the upper classes. In America, it was very much associated with the working class, which was a sharp contrast to how Christianity was in Europe. There was, and I would say sometimes this took them into dangerous territory, like me and my Bible alone, we can figure this out, right? And sometimes a de-emphasis of church structure and church discipline, which leads somebody like a Joseph Smith to go off and start a completely heretical religion that he's figured out for himself, right?
At the same time, the frontier lifestyle contributed to that.
Absolutely.
It wasn't always a rebellious, I don't need anybody above me. It was sometimes just, I didn't have anybody.
Yeah. So that's the next slide, I think. Or it's coming soon. While we're on that.
Well, I was going to say, Finney was obviously not married with children.
They discouraged itinerant circuit riding preachers from having wives and kids for obvious reasons.
Yeah, had he been married and had children, he would have realized it's not the will of man to bring them to God.
Right. Right. This is farther ahead than I thought. Yeah, this is your point, Tom. American Christianity was always destined to be, I think, something different from European Christianity simply because of the geography, right? Just the ability to spread out and keep spreading out. And it's hard to have much control of religion when people can just keep moving west, right? So you have American Christianity becomes much more pluralistic than what you had back in Europe. And again, what's probably underappreciated is the massive size of America in generating this religious pluralism. So we talk about Europe. Europe had this patchwork of established state churches. I'm going to show you a map here in a minute. So this is just Central Europe in the year 1330. This is one of those things when you see this, you're like, oh, a lot of this makes a lot more sense now. This was Central Europe in the year 1337. Every one of these is a different country, a different kingdom, right? Here's France. This is mostly what's today Germany. It's nuts. And each one of these states had their own state-established religion that had a monopoly in that. That was a really small, a lot of this is like probably smaller than Merritt County, right? And if you had a king of Merritt County, and Merritt County has one state established religion. It might be, well, this is before the Reformation. But even after the Reformation, these might be Lutheran, these might be Catholic down here, these might be Calvinist here, but it wasn't a melting pot, it was a patchwork quilt with very small pieces, each piece distinct. So not a melting thing blended together, just these small patchwork. This is not what you get in America. You get something very, very different. Here's another map. This is from 1444. We were looking at just this area here. Now it kind of pans out a little bit more. These are all different kingdoms. None of them are, by the way, democratic republics. None of them are democracies. But they each have their own, virtually all of these would have been some version of Christianity, except for the Ottomans down here who are Muslim. But most of these would have had some version of Christianity with an established state church over everyone in that state. Does that make sense? So when you come to America and people just spread out, you do get a melting pot that's very different from what you see in Europe. And you have room for all of these things to spring up that are new and sometimes orthodox, sometimes unorthodox, sometimes heretical, right? Okay, so seemed like a good time to mention that. Where were we? Let's see. There was more confidence, more of an emphasis on the individual believer's competence to receive direction from the Holy Spirit and from his own individual interpretation of the Bible. In European Old World Catholicism, much of religion was in Latin that people didn't even speak. And so the priest told you what was in the Bible, told you what to think about it. In the new world of democratic American Christianity, an individual could read his Bible for himself and interpret it for himself, and sometimes without much church structure, it wasn't even really doing it within the context of a church. It was sometimes much more individualistic. Does that make sense? Sometimes there were anti-intellectual currents. Sometimes a preference for preachers who weren't overeducated, who didn't use too much theological language, just used simple, direct, kind of a moving, more charismatic preaching style. And if you go, I mean, again, this is why I began with the image of the ark, because some of these things are going to feel like critiques. Some of them are going to feel like things we're really thankful for. I don't even know how to make sense out of all of this, except to know that God's in control of His church, but we're kind of a wild, woolly bunch. And we definitely have strengths and weaknesses, and we're definitely influenced a lot more than we think we are by cultural currents, by political currents, and we'd like to think that I'm only influenced by my clear reading of the Bible. And that is the goal. I think we have to be honest that there's a lot of other winds that push us one direction or another. Does that make sense? And I think it's healthy to try to, we're all born with a set of glasses, right? And none of our glasses are completely clear. And I think it's important sometimes to try to take off our glasses and say, how does this lens that I was born with, how does it affect how I see God, how I see other human beings, how I see society? Like as best as we can, trying to hold those lenses to the scriptures and to do this within the context of a church body, because I think we're meant to do this together and to help balance each other out rather than to do it individualistically, all by myself, right? But we get in trouble when we want to go off from a healthy church and do it all by myself, right? You're going to say something?
Actually, a lot of this is how Ken and I grew up.
Yeah. For those who don't know, Ken and Greta grew up in the Sandhills, very far from your nearest neighbor, far from a church. Yeah.
And so it's still individually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of that's just the product of where you grew up, right? Yeah. Doesn't mean that it's right or wrong, but it means there's certain, we get nudged in certain directions or other directions, right?
But a lot of this is because we grew up in churches maybe with a less educated pastor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And maybe church once every 6 weeks.
Right.
The rest of the time it was a neighbor that kept the church open.
Right.
You know, just
Right.
totally.
So this is a lot of you don't know this story. This is total sidetrack. Greta got me off track. So my family ended up in Nebraska. You know the story. Because in 1973, my grandpa, he farmed in Chester, but during the school year, he farmed with his brother in the summer, but taught in Denver public schools in the school year. But he bought an airplane, a 4-seater airplane, and his excuse was he'd been to some seminary, and he told his wife, "This is so I can fly to these different country churches on Sunday morning." And so he would leave the Denver airport on Sunday morning with 3 buddies. It was a 4-seater plane. He was flying, and they would land at these on gravel roads or country roads in western Nebraska, western Kansas, eastern Colorado. And they'd land the plane. First guy would get out at a little country church of 30 people. They'd fly to the second little church, maybe 100 miles away. The second guy would get out. Third church, the third guy would get out. The fourth church, my grandpa would park the airplane in front of the church, country church, and would get out and preach that Sunday. So they were circuit flying preachers. And it was July of 1973, and he was at the church. He landed on Highway 183 north of, you know this better than I do, north of Taylor, between Taylor and Bassett, right? Landed on the paved state highway, pulled off there's a little church on the west side of the road, right? Which was where, Ken, I think that was your family's church.
East side.
East side of the road, okay. Anyway, he preached that Sunday morning, and it just so happened that Nebraska Christian had just lost their superintendent. Suddenly, unexpectedly, it was July, and the school board president, who was a rancher, was at that church, and he asked my grandpa to come take the position of superintendent for that. He had a month, right, and half of the staff had quit. So my grandpa said yes, and that's how we ended up in Central City, is one of these country churches with probably 30 people, and like you said, they didn't have a regular pastor, and that because 30 people couldn't afford to support a pastor and his family. So a similar dynamic, right? Yeah. And my grandpa wasn't under the board of any particular church body. He was just, the Holy Spirit. So God uses, one of my points at the end of this is God can write straight lines with a crooked stick. And thankfully, otherwise there would be no church, right? Because that's all he has to work with is crooked sticks, us. And he somehow still manages to keep the church on track in spite of us, right? Sorry, that was all free. That was a side. But we do see in the shift from Puritan, we're about out of time, Puritan kind of Calvinistic religion to with 2-hour-long sermons that were densely theological, a shift to much shorter, more emotionally charged, less doctrinal, less complex sermons, which inevitably led to emphasis on the gifting of the speaking ability, the preaching giftedness of certain preachers and their ability to communicate, right? If you're a Puritan guy and you're installed for 30 years and you don't polish your technique very much, it doesn't matter because you're getting paid either way from the denomination, right? There was a distrusting of older forms, a distrusting of creeds, a distrusting of liturgy. Some of that was the baby that got thrown out with the bathwater, I would argue. There was definitely more emphasis on popular, singable hymns that were more, we don't think of them today as popular contemporary music, but they were in the 1800s. So a lot more diversity in doctrine and theology and worship practices, worship styles. I'm going to skip some of this because it'd take too long, but you did have this explosion of religious sects or religious denominations started by sometimes entrepreneurial evangelists, but sometimes this went off the rails when you had religious demagogues like Joseph Smith using this freer, unregulated climate to do some really bad things, right?
Nathan, would you say overall, this is the first time I've listened, but like the way the founders, wrote the First Amendment, allowing kind of setting it up for this free for all for religious ideas, that's been healthy for the church?
It seems like the net result is something that God really used for explosive growth in the American church. Like lots of things, I think maybe that's not how I would have done it, but but God uses all kinds of circumstances and does what He does. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like historically, if you have an institution, a religious institution that gets really powerful, it just tends to get corrupt
Yeah.
quickly and lose sight of its original mission. So by kind of opening the door for,
Mm-hmm.
I knew if a denomination does get that way, like the Puritans did,
Yeah.
something else can come in that
Yeah.
just focus on the truth. And,
Right. One metaphor that got used a lot was we got to break these old wineskins and have, that metaphor that Jesus used, old wine or new wine and old wineskins. And sometimes the forms have to get busted open. Yeah. Other thoughts? You can see the definite influence on our style of church today, right? Where, I'd like to think that our sermons are theologically rich, but our worship styles are it's more popular style of worship, emphasis on effective communication in preaching. We're definitely the inheritors of this style of church worship, right? Amanda.
I've just appreciated having better understanding of where the thoughts and ideas and beliefs that I grew up with
Mm-hmm.
came from. The things that aren't connected to
Mm-hmm.
scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Where did these beliefs come from? Where does this idea come from? It's been I really have
Mm-hmm.
appreciated that understanding.
Yeah, I would argue that the American church has a tendency toward de-emphasizing, to our detriment, de-emphasizing the church, like church authority, church, the body of Christ. I think we have a tendency, an unhealthy tendency toward independence. Like, if I don't like this, I'm just going to go. I'm going to find another church that I like their worship style better, or I like their preaching style better, and so church discipline is really hard in America because people and it's from the beginning, you just move west, you just move. Whereas in Europe, or even in these small towns in New England, you had to hash it out because you were stuck there with these people, right? So there's good and bad. I would make the case that we veer toward the guardrail sometimes of being overly independent. I can figure this out with my Bible by myself, and if I don't like, I'm just going to move, right? So.
I think that it actually sounds like I'm contradicting you, but I don't think I am. Because so much of what we believe is derived from that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's helpful for me in dealing with adult children in particular to realize that not everything that I like about the way I worship and the styles that we use are mandated by Scripture, and it's okay
Yeah.
that my kids
Yeah.
have chosen something
Right.
different because of that.
Yeah.
Which sounds like I'm giving them more individual freedom, but
Mm-hmm.
I have to if mine is structured on that kind of
Right.
individual freedom.
Sometimes I wish the New Testament gave us more direction about church governance structures, but it really doesn't give very much instruction on that. Which is why the church seems to thrive under all kinds of political circumstances, all kinds of cultural circumstances. That's how Jesus set it up, right?
And there obviously are appropriate times to leave a church and
Yeah.
seek another.
Yeah.
That you feel like one is not preaching
Right.
the word.
Right. Yeah, I don't mean to suggest that no one should ever leave a church body, but we need to take those kinds of decisions seriously and think about why am I doing this?
If you're running away from something.
Right,
Or if
right.
you're, yeah, that's what you were more talking about, is if you're running away from something instead of confronting something.
Right, right.
It's different.
Yeah.
There were legitimate reasons to go to Nineveh.
What's that?
There were legitimate reasons to go to Nineveh.
To go to Nineveh?
Or not to Nineveh, to Tarsus.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Jonah didn't have one, but there were legitimate
Yeah.
reasons.
Right. Yeah.
Some people on that ship were there for a good reason.
Right. Right. Any final thoughts? All right. We did not get through this, not surprisingly. So we'll try to tie this up next week, and then we'll only have one more week after that. So, Tom, would you close us in prayer?